Last week, I was watching a local contractor finish a renovation next door. He was leaning against his truck, complaining loudly about the state of the local roads and how the city never has any money for infrastructure. But when the homeowner came out to settle the bill, I saw a thick, rubber-banded stack of $100 bills change hands. No invoice was signed. No sales tax was mentioned. The contractor tucked the cash away with a satisfied, almost conspiratorial wink, as if he'd just won a small war against the system. He saw himself as a savvy underdog, just a guy keeping what was rightfully his. To him, that envelope was a private victory. But as I watched him drive away, I started thinking about the sheer audacity of that confidence. He felt like he was playing a tiny, invisible game. But if you take that one envelope and multiply it by the millions of unregistered street vendors in Lagos, the untracked digital transfers in Shenzhen, and the off-the-books laborers in London, you realize we aren't looking at a few rebels, we're looking at a ghost. There is a famous, almost poetic gap in our global data that economists are only now beginning to reconcile. When researchers look at satellite imagery of the Earth at night, they see cities glowing with vibrant, pulsing electricity shining factories, lit-up malls, and busy ports. But when they cross-reference those lights with the official tax records and bank data for those same regions, the numbers don't match. On paper, those places should be dark. The money, according to the government, simply isn't there. We've built a global civilization where nearly 30% of the world's work happens in total silence. We're talking about an annual flow of $13 trillion, a hidden empire the size of the entire Chinese economy that technically does not exist. It is a system that funds our neighbors while hollowing out our institutions, a paradox that is both a survival mechanism for the poor and a playground for the elite. It's called the shadow economy, and it is far more organized than the official world would like to admit.
And that phenomenon, that massive disconnect you're talking about between the lights you can see from space and the numbers on a ledger.
Yeah.
That's really the perfect entry point for our deep dive today.
Right.
Because we're focusing on something very specific, is what happens when that shadow economy, that cash from the contractor, crosses an international border. When it's disguised to look like legitimate trade, it gets a much more technical name. Illicit Financial Flows, or IFFs.
Okay, so that distinction is crucial. When I hear illicit financial flow, I'm thinking of, a suitcase full of cash on a plane, but it sounds like it's much, much more complex than that. What's the core definition we need to hang on to here?
It's actually a very broad but really critical definition. The key is illegality at any point in the process.
Any point.
Any point. So IFFs are illegal movements of money or capital from one country to another. But the flow is considered illicit if the funds were illegally earned, say, from corruption or drug trafficking, or if they were illegally transferred to dodge taxes or currency controls, or finally, if they're illegally utilized on the other side, like for funding terrorism. If it breaks a law at any stage, earning, transferring, or using, the whole thing is an IFF.
And the sheer scale of this is where it stops being just an accounting problem and becomes a full-blown development crisis.
Right.
Especially for emerging economies.
That's where the damage is most acute. The numbers are, frankly, staggering. Researchers who compiled the data for the decade between 2004 and 2013 found something pretty shocking.
And that is?
The developing nations lost a cumulative total of $7.8 trillion in these illicit flows.
7.8 trillion.
Trillion, with a T. To put that into some kind of perspective, that's roughly the combined annual GDP of Germany and the United Kingdom. Just vanished, gone from the places that need that capital the most.
And that's over a decade. But I'm guessing the problem wasn't getting better during that time. It's probably accelerating.
It absolutely was. The annual amount of money being siphoned off was hitting new records. Illicit outflows crossed the $1 trillion mark for the first time around 2011.
$1 trillion a year.
And they peaked at $1.1 trillion in 2013 alone. This wasn't just a static problem. The flow was growing in real terms at about 6.5% a year. That's faster than the GDP growth of most of the countries it was bleeding dry.
So if that $1.1 trillion ghost is what we're tracking, then our mission for this deep dive is to figure out exactly how that money gets made invisible. We need to unpack the main mechanisms, this commercial fraud called trade misinvoicing, and these financial leaks known as hot money flows. Then we'll look at the global scorecard, see who the biggest culprits are. And finally, and this is the important part, we have to look at the response. How are high-growth Asian economies like China, Malaysia, Thailand, and others trying to bring this hidden activity back into the light?
And to do that, you have to start with a main pipeline because, like you said, this isn't about cash in suitcases. It's about creating a commercial illusion on a global scale.
The moment you hear a figure like $1.1 trillion being moved illegally in a single year, the process has to be, well, industrialized. It has to look legitimate from the outside. So here's the critical question. What is the dominant mechanism? And maybe more importantly, how do researchers even measure something that is, by its very nature, designed to be hidden?
Right. So the dominant measurable pipeline is trade misinvoicing. That's the big one.
Trade misinvoicing.
And it's measured using a statistical method called gross excluding reversals, or GER. It's basically the main way we can track funds being illicitly shifted out of developing countries.
So GER, how does it work? Is it like forensic accounting for an entire country?
That's a great way to put it. It's essentially a massive accounting reconciliation. The methodology highlights the gaps between what one country says it's exporting to the world and what the rest of the world says it's importing from that country.
Ah, so you're looking for discrepancies in the global ledger.
Exactly. You compare global trade stats. Let's say country A reports shipping $1 billion of timber to country B, but country B's records show they only received $800 million worth of timber from country A.
So where did the other $200 million go?
That's the question. That gap is a potential illicit flow. By adding up all those gaps globally, researchers can start to quantify this capital flight that's disguised as normal commerce.
So when you do that, when you look for all those gaps, just how dominant is this one method, trade misinvoicing, compared to everything else you can track?
It's not just dominant, it's practically the whole story, at least of what's measurable. Over that 10-year period, trade misinvoicing accounted for an average of 83.4% of all measurable illicit financial flows.
Wow, over 80%.
If you put that into dollars, you're talking about roughly $654.7 billion US dollars being moved illegally every year under the cover of trade. It's the overwhelming engine behind this capital hemorrhage.
That 83.4% statistic is incredible. It basically tells you that if you want to run a $1 trillion criminal enterprise, you don't use guns, you use shipping containers and customs forms. Why is trade the perfect cover?
Because it's a system that's built on trust and volume. It's decentralized, it's fast, there are millions of transactions a day across every commodity imaginable. And a lot of the time, it relies on paperwork generated by the traders themselves.
So it's easy to cheat.
It's easy to hide the cheating. The practice of deliberately misstating the value or the volume of a shipment on a customs invoice, that's a specific crime called trade-based money laundering, or TBML.
TBML?
Criminals, corrupt officials, tax evaders. They all love it because global trade is so complex and so high volume that customs agencies are just drowning in paperwork.
Right.
They simply can't cross-reference every single shipment against real-time world market prices.
Okay, let's break that down for you listening. If I'm a criminal in a developing country and I want to move $1 million out to a safe place, maybe a shell company I own in a tax haven, what are the two specific ways I can do that using trade?
There are two main methods, and they're basically mirror images of each other. Both are designed to move money out of the country.
Okay.
The first one is called import over-invoicing.
Over-invoicing, so paying too much.
Exactly. Picture a company, let's call it Coastal Imports. They want to move $1 million out. So they legitimately buy a shipment of, say, specialized mining equipment that's actually worth $5 million.
Right, a real product.
A real product. But they get their partner overseas, who is probably a shell company they secretly control, to create a customs invoice saying the equipment costs $6 million. They wire the full $6 million to the seller, $5 million pays for the goods, and that extra $1 million overpayment is now sitting safely offshore, laundered and disguised as a legitimate cost of doing business back home.
So you overpay for an import and the extra cash is now clean and offshore. What's the flip side of that then?
That's export under-invoicing. It's the exact reverse. Let's say our company is now exporting, high-grade coffee beans.
Yeah.
The shipment is actually worth $10 million on the world market. They ship the beans, but they create a customs invoice that says the export value is only $8 million.
So they're pretending they sold it for cheap.
Precisely. The foreign buyer, again, probably a company they control, pays the $8 million, and that's the only revenue that comes back home to be taxed. The other $2 million, the difference between the real value and the fake value, never even enters the country. It just stays offshore.
So in one case, you're paying too much, and the other, you're getting paid too little. But either way, the goal is the same. Get the capital out of the country and away from the tax authorities. You mentioned this often gets more complicated with middlemen involved.
Yes, very often. The most sophisticated schemes use a technique called re-invoicing.
Re-invoicing.
This is where the goods don't even go directly from buyer to seller. They technically pass through a company in a tax haven, say, the Cayman Islands. The invoice gets rewritten there to show the fake price before the goods continue to their final destination.
So it adds another layer of confusion.
It adds a critical layer of opacity. It makes it almost impossible for a customs official in the destination country to trace the original transaction value.
Now, you said earlier that this GER estimate, this $654 billion a year, is inherently conservative. If this one thing we can measure is that big, what are we missing? What are the big leakages that this method can't even see?
Right, and this is so important to remember. The GER calculation is based entirely on official data trade statistics economic records. It simply cannot capture the major ways money moves that leave no paper trail at all.
Like what?
Well, the most obvious one is physical bulk cash transfers, just literally carrying money across a border.
The suitcase full of cash is still a thing.
It's still a very big thing. We're also completely missing transactions done through informal money transfer systems, like the Hawala system.
Right, the trust-based networks.
Exactly. They move billions of dollars around the globe based on honor and ledger entries in notebooks, not bank wires. So there's no official record for GER to catch.
And what about within the trade system itself? Are there tricks that GER can't spot?
Oh, yes. For example, GER can't detect when parties just agree to create fake or duplicate invoices for the very same shipment. That's called same invoice faking.
I see.
And maybe the biggest blind spot going forward is that GER is much better at tracking physical goods, copper, coffee, cars, than it is at tracking misinvoicing in the services and intangible sector. And that's a massive and growing part of the global economy.
So the real number is almost certainly much, much higher than 1.1 trillion. That's a sobering thought. If trade misinvoicing is this giant engine driving over 80% of the flows, what about the other piece, that roughly 17% that doesn't look like commercial fraud?
That secondary mechanism is what economists call hot money narrow, or HMN.
Hot money narrow.
If GER is about capturing deliberate commercial fraud, HMN is about capturing the less structured, more purely financial or black market leakage that leaves a different kind of trace in the system.
How can hot money leave a trace if it's designed to be hidden?
It leaves a trace as a statistical ghost. HMN is defined as leakages that are reflected in a country's balance of payment system.
Okay. The national counts.
Right. Every country has to keep a record of all its international transactions, its balance of payments. And in theory, when you add up all the inflows and outflows, they should balance out to zero.
But they never do.
They almost never do. There are always errors, omissions, unrecorded movements. So the International Monetary Fund has this official line item called net errors and omissions, or NEOs, which is basically a plug figure to make the books balance.
The official, we don't know where this money went line.
That's a perfect way to describe it. And HMN figures are derived from that mysterious line item. It represents capital that moved out through financial channels that weren't disguised as trade. It's the money that just vanished from the official records without a clear paper trail.
Okay, that makes the distinction really clear. GER is faking the paperwork on purpose. HMN is the ghost in the machine, the gap in the ledger that we assume is mostly illicit capital flight. Has the balance between these two methods changed over time? Are criminals getting more creative?
There's been a noticeable shift. HMN has grown, which suggests that purely financial channels are becoming a more popular tool for capital flight.
How much has it grown?
Well, back in 2004, HMN was only about 6.9% of total IFFs. Trade misinvoicing was almost everything. But by 2013, HMN had risen to 19.4%.
So it nearly tripled its share.
Exactly. And that trend suggests that the methods are evolving. They're using more black market finance, more unrecorded transfers, not just relying on trade.
Does this strategy, trade fraud versus this financial leakage change depending on where you are in the world? Do criminals in Africa use different tools than criminals in, say, Latin America?
Yes, there are very clear regional preferences, which tells you a lot about the local economies and the regulatory weaknesses.
For instance?
In the more developed emerging economies, so think developing Europe and the Western Hemisphere, they lean very heavily on the trade misinvoicing route. GER makes up around 88% of their illicit outflows. The falsified trade invoice is their tool of choice.
And what about Asia, which we know is the biggest source in sheer volume?
Asia is also very high on GDR at about 83.6%, still the massive majority. But what's really interesting is where HMN, the hot money, plays a relatively bigger role.
Where is that?
Sub-Saharan Africa and the MENA plus AP region, that's the Middle East, North Africa, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, they show a much higher reliance on the financial leakages of HMN.
How much higher?
In Sub-Saharan Africa, GER is only about 71.5% of the total. That means almost a third of their leakage is this harder to trace hot money.
Yeah.
And in the MENA plus AP region, it's even more pronounced. GER is down to 63.6%, meaning HMN accounts for over a third of their illicit outflows.
That's a huge difference. So if those regions rely more heavily on HMN, which is basically the untraced gap in the books, does that mean their illicit flows are fundamentally harder for authorities to track and regulate?
That is precisely the challenge. Trade misinvoicing, for all its complexity, at least leaves a document, a customs form, a wire transfer that looks like a payment for goods. There's a trail to follow, even if it's a false one.
Right.
HMN, by its very definition, represents capital that moved through channels that are so opaque, so informal, or so deep in the black market that the authorities don't even have the starting paperwork.
So it suggests things like underground banking or bulk cash smuggling are more common there?
It does. And it means that the policy response has to be different. To fight GER, you need customs reform and better data sharing. To fight HMN, you need intense financial surveillance and much stronger domestic controls. You can't just apply a one-size-fits-all solution.
We've laid out the mechanics, the invoice fraud, the financial ghosts, but we have to come back to the consequence, the real human cost of this. The argument isn't just that these flows are illegal, it's that they are actively gutting the potential for growth and poverty reduction in developing countries. Let's really hit on the shock factor here. The direct competition between legitimate aid money flowing in and this criminal money flowing out.
This comparison is where the data becomes truly, truly devastating. You look at the two main sources of external funding for a developing country: official development assistance, or ODA, that's foreign aid, and inward foreign direct investment, or FDI, that's investment from foreign companies.
The good money, basically.
The good money. The money meant to build roads, schools, and factories. And the finding is that illicit financial flows were greater than ODA and FDI combined for 7 of the 10 years that were studied.
7 out of 10 years.
7 out of 10. The developing world was essentially taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back. More energy was being spent just trying to stop the financial bleeding than was being gained from all its best external resources combined.
It just suggests that all the international aid conferences, all the efforts to attract investment are being systematically hollowed out from the inside by criminals and tax dodgers. Can you give us the single most staggering metric on that?
I can. The specific number for 2013 is the one that should stop every policymaker in their tracks. In that year, $1.1 trillion flowed illicitly out of the developing world.
Okay, the 1.1 trillion.
In that same year, those same countries received just $99.3 billion in foreign aid.
So the gap is more than 10 to 1.
The conclusion is undeniable. For every single dollar of aid that entered the developing world in 2013, more than $10 exited illegally.
10 to 1. That's like trying to fill a bathtub with a teaspoon while someone has a fire hose pumping the water out.
It is. It shows that all goodwill, all the aid is just completely swamped by the sheer scale of leakage. And it really reframes the whole development debate.
How so?
It tells you that simply increasing aid isn't the answer. The real solution is helping these countries curb the IFFs. If they could keep even a fraction of that $1.1 trillion a year, their need for external aid would plummet. They could fund their own development.
Okay, let's move from the cost to the source. If we were to make a leaderboard of the top culprits, the countries with the highest dollar volume of these illicit flows, who would we see at the top of that list?
Well, as a region, Asia completely dominates in terms of sheer dollar volume. Over that decade, Asia was the source of 38.8% of the total. That's a staggering $3.048 trillion cumulatively.
$3 trillion from Asia alone.
Developing Europe was second, at around 25%. But what's really crucial here is the concentration. The problem isn't evenly spread out.
So a few countries are responsible for most of it.
A huge amount of it.
Yeah.
The top 10 source countries collectively account for 62.3% of the entire developing world's illicit financial outflows.
Let's run through the top 5, because these numbers are going to be immense. Who's number 1?
At the very top of the list is mainland China, with an average of $139.2 billion flowing out illegally every single year.
$139 billion a year.
That massive volume reflects its position as the world's factory, the largest trading nation. The sheer scale of its commerce just creates colossal opportunities for misinvoicing and capital flight.
And who's number 2?
In the second spot is the Russian Federation, averaging nearly $105 billion a year.
Also a huge number.
And Russia's case is often characterized by its reliance on natural resource exports, oil, gas, minerals, where pricing can be very opaque and easy to manipulate.
And then third and fourth, we have two of the world's biggest democracies.
We do. Number 3 is Mexico, at about $52.8 billion a year. It's a massive trade hub and, of course, a critical transit country for illicit goods, so trade is often used to launder money. And fourth is India at $51 billion, another giant, fast-growing economy where that rapid change can create regulatory gaps that are easily exploited.
And who rounds out the top 5?
Number 5 is Malaysia, averaging about $41.8 billion a year, a major, highly trade-dependent economy in Southeast Asia.
So you have China, Russia, Mexico, India, Malaysia. The rest of the top 10 includes Brazil, South Africa, Thailand, Indonesia, and Nigeria. What's the common thread here, besides just being big economies?
They share a few key traits. They all have very high trade volumes, they tend to be rich in natural resources, and they have dynamic financial systems, but with, let's say, varying degrees of regulatory oversight.
And that high trade volume is the key.
It's the perfect cover. The immense volume of legitimate trade allows billions of dollars in fraud to just blend in with trillions of dollars in real commerce. It's not the small, fragile states bleeding the most in absolute terms. It's the big engines of the developing world.
But that's just the story in pure dollars. As you said, $1 billion lost from a tiny economy is a catastrophe, but for a huge economy, it might be a rounding error. So we need that vulnerability metric, IFFs, as a percentage of the whole economy, of GDP.
This is a critical distinction, completely flips the regional picture on its head and shows you where the real economic pain is being felt.
So when we switch from pure volume to impact relative to GDP, who gets hurt the most?
The region that suffers the most, by far, is Sub-Saharan Africa. Even though it's one of the smaller sources in nominal dollars, its illicit financial outflows averaged 6.1% of its regional GDP over that decade.
Wow, 6% of your entire yearly economic output just gone, illegally extracted. That's astronomical.
It's debilitating. The vulnerability comes from a few structural weaknesses. These are often smaller economies. They're more dependent on single commodities like oil or minerals, and they have fewer resources for things like customs enforcement or financial intelligence.
So the impact is just magnified.
It's exponential. When you lose 6.1% of your GDP, it doesn't just mean less money for schools. It means your currency is unstable, you can't service your debt, and you can't attract legitimate foreign investment because the economy is so volatile. It's a vicious cycle.
So where does Asia, the volume leader, fall in this vulnerability ranking?
It drops significantly. Developing Europe actually follows Africa at around 5.9% of GDP. But Asia, despite its huge volume, averages about 3.8%. It's a huge problem, but not as existentially threatening on average as it is in Africa.
And this really confirms that it's not just about the big numbers, it's about the catastrophic effect on the most fragile economies. I want to circle back to the main mechanism, trade misinvoicing, and connect it directly to organized crime. Because this isn't just about corporations dodging taxes, is it? We're talking about drug cartels.
Oh, absolutely. Trade misinvoicing is the bread and butter of what we call trade-based money laundering, and it's used extensively by sophisticated criminal networks.
They have to clean their money somehow.
They have to. Drug cartels, arms dealers, human traffickers, they're dealing with massive volumes of dirty cash. They need to convert it into assets that look legitimate and move it across borders. And the speed and opacity of global trade make it the perfect washing machine.
The scale of the global drug trade alone must require an industrial-grade laundry service. Do we have data that actually links higher rates of trade misinvoicing to major drug countries?
We do. There's a very strong correlation in the data.
Here.
Researchers looked at the ratio of trade misinvoicing to total trade for countries that are known as major drug-producing or drug transit nations.
And what's the baseline?
The average for the entire developing world was 6.7%. So on average, 6.7% of total trade value was being misinvoiced.
And for the drug-linked countries?
They found that 15 out of the 22 major drug-linked countries they looked at had a ratio well above that 6.7% average. In many cases, significantly higher.
That feels like a smoking gun. If your country's misinvoicing rate is way higher than average, it's a very strong indicator that drug traffickers are using your trade systems, import over-invoicing and export under-invoicing, to wash their profits.
It confirms it. It shows that the global trade system isn't just being used by tax-evading companies. It's being actively hijacked by some of the most violent and destructive criminal enterprises on the planet. For them, that customs transaction is the final critical step to make their blood money look like a legitimate business deal.
The scale of these IFFs is just immense. And as we saw, Asia is the biggest source in terms of pure volume. But the challenge for governments there isn't just catching some criminal mastermind faking invoices. It's also about the millions of ordinary people, the contractor I mentioned, the street vendors who make up the informal or shadow economy. You can't get control of the big illicit flows until you formalize the small ones. So now we turn to how Asian countries are trying to do both, using technology to fight the high-level crime and social policy to integrate the informal economy.
Yeah, and Asia is really the most fascinating place to look at this because you have this incredibly dynamic economic growth happening alongside historically massive informal sectors. So they're developing this really interesting dual-track approach.
What's that?
On one hand, you have intensive technological integration, digital payments, surveillance to get financial control. And on the other, you have these carefully designed social policies to bring vulnerable workers into the formal system without crushing them.
Let's start with China. It's number one in terms of IFF volume, but it's also a world leader in using technology. The sources point to its massive push for economic digitalization. What effect is that having on the shadow economy?
China's approach is really a blueprint that a lot of other emerging economies are watching closely. The huge government-backed push for digital payment systems, getting billions of daily transactions off of cash and onto traceable platforms, that is directly contributing to formalizing economic activity.
Because every digital transaction leaves a trail.
It leaves a permanent, transparent trail. And that's a trail that tax authorities, financial regulators, and customs agencies can potentially access and analyze. So this massive digitalization plus the new regulations that go with it allows the government to see that economic activity, to tax it, and to integrate it, rather than having it vanish into untracked cash or black markets. It's a powerful and mostly non-coercive way to bring things into the light.
But wait a minute. If you make the domestic economy super transparent and digital, doesn't that just push the really big criminals, the ones moving billions away from digital platforms, and back toward the one mechanism that can handle that scale, which is trade misinvoicing?
That is a fantastic question, and it's the constant cat-and-mouse game for policymakers. When you close one door, criminal activity always looks for the next open window.
Right.
As China's domestic digital economy becomes highly regulated, it is very likely that the high-value illicit actors will rely even more heavily on those complex cross-border schemes like trade misinvoicing and using offshore shell companies.
So you have to fight it on two fronts.
You have to. You use digitalization to clean up the domestic informality and tax evasion. But at the same time, you have to use advanced customs enforcement and international cooperation to attack the trade fraud engine. One without the other won't work.
That makes perfect sense. Are we seeing a similar digital push in other big Southeast Asian economies?
We absolutely are. The sources highlight countries like Vietnam, which was 18th on our list of IFF volume, and Indonesia, which was 9th. These countries are accelerating their digitalization efforts and strengthening their regulatory frameworks at incredible speed.
And is it working?
The analysis shows that it is. These transformations, everything from digital ID programs to better financial monitoring systems, are actively helping to reduce the shadow economy's share of their GDP. It's fostering transparency and bringing previously hidden activity into the official economy, which expands the tax base and gives them more money for sustainable growth.
Okay, so digitalization is a key tool. But as you said, the informal sector is also where millions of vulnerable people make their living. If you regulate it too hard or too fast, you risk destroying their only source of income. This seems to require a much more nuanced approach.
This is the really complex human side of the challenge, and it brings us to Malaysia and Thailand. In countries where the informal sector provides a huge share of jobs and GDP, you can't just crack down. The policy has to offer a path to formality that comes with real benefits, like a social safety net.
Let's start with Thailand. What's their approach?
Well, what's remarkable about Thailand is the technical rigor they bring to just measuring the problem. They aren't guessing at the size of their shadow economy. They're using really complex economic modeling to map it out precisely.
What does that look like? How are they getting such a clear picture?
First, they use incredibly detailed and updated census data. They're sampling thousands of areas across the country to get a really granular picture of who these informal workers are and where they live.
So good data collection.
But the really sophisticated part is the macroeconomic modeling they use. They have these complex econometric equations that are based on things like currency, stocks, and income velocity.
Okay, that sounds complicated.
It is, but the idea is simple. They're basically doing a decomposition of all the cash and deposits in the economy to figure out how much of it is reported and, crucially, how much of it is unreported. This gives them a precise, defensible estimate of the hidden income in their system.
That's incredible. So they're using high-level economics just to see what they're up against before they even design a policy.
Exactly. They're not flying blind.
Now let's turn to Malaysia. The sources give us a really detailed picture of the informal worker there and the specific policies being used to support them. How big is the informal sector in Malaysia?
It's massive. On average, it contributes about 31% of Malaysia's GDP. And because of rapid urbanization, the urban informal sector has exploded. It went from about 63% of the total in 2012 to over 82% by 2017.
So this isn't some fringe part of the economy.
Not at all. It's integral. It's your petty traders, street hawkers, laborers, and it serves as a critical income buffer for people during tough economic times.
And what's the profile of the typical worker in the sector? How vulnerable are they?
The profile reveals a population that is extremely vulnerable to economic shocks. The vast majority, 9 out of 10, are ethnic Malays. Their average household income from this work is around 2,120 ringgit a month. But here's the shocking part.
What's that?
A staggering 95.7% of these workers are engaged without any kind of formal contract.
No contract, so no job security, no benefits, no legal standing.
Nothing. And critically, half of them reported that they had no adequate financial protection against emergencies. No savings, no safety net. This immediately tells you what the policy goal has to be in Malaysia. It's not just about collecting more taxes. It's about protecting this huge vital part of the workforce from total collapse.
So it's a huge balancing act. You have to support the vulnerable workers while cracking down on the criminal networks. What are the key policies Malaysia is using to walk that tightrope?
They're focused on a three-pronged approach: support, capital, and security.
Okay, let's start with the first one, business support services. What does that mean on the ground?
It means making it easier and more appealing to become formal. They're setting up business advisory units to help people figure out how to run their micro-businesses more effectively. And, importantly, they're creating new, legal, petty business centers in consultation with the vendors themselves.
So they're working with them, not against them.
Exactly. It reduces the sense of being harassed by enforcement agencies. And they're simplifying the bureaucratic licensing procedures. The easier it is to be legitimate, the more people will choose to be.
But it must be hard to get a street vendor who's operated in cash for 20 years to suddenly trust the government?
It is, and that requires tangible benefits, which leads to the second policy area, the provision of financial aids.
So access to money.
Access to capital. They're providing loans and grants through trusted government agencies. This gives these micro-businesses the capital they need to grow, which they could never get from a traditional bank. They're also providing more education aid for the children of these workers, seeing it as a multi-generational pathway out of poverty.
Okay, so support and capital. But the biggest vulnerability you mentioned was the lack of a safety net. No savings, no insurance. How are they tackling that?
This is the third and maybe the most crucial policy direction. They recognize that these workers need a tailor-made protection scheme. The recommendation is to create a savings scheme that specifically includes things like health insurance, maybe models on their existing employees' provident fund, or EPF.
So a social security system for the informal sector.
That's essentially what it is. It would allow workers to contribute and then withdraw money if they face a crisis, acting as a financial shock absorber. It directly addresses that core vulnerability of having no savings. And they're also encouraging traders to form associations and cooperatives to foster mutual help and community resilience.
So what we're seeing across Asia is this really sophisticated understanding that the shadow economy isn't one single enemy. It's a complex spectrum. And you need digital tools to fight the high-level fraud, but you need social protection to bring the everyday worker out of the shadows.
That's the holistic approach. Yeah. You have to address both the $100 cash contractor and the billion-dollar trade fraud scheme if you really want to mobilize your domestic resources and achieve sustainable development.
This deep dive has made it just profoundly clear that illicit financial flows are a fundamental development crisis. It's not some niche economic issue for bankers to worry about, that 10-to-1 ratio of money flowing out versus aid flowing in. I mean, it just shows that any effort to alleviate global poverty is doomed to fail if this issue isn't tackled head-on.
And the international community has certainly started to recognize that severity. Curbing IFFs is now officially part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's Goal 16.4 to be specific.
Right.
And you have global efforts like the Addis Tax Initiative, which all recognize that mobilizing your own domestic resources is the only real foundation for sustainable growth. The sources are crystal clear on this. You can't have effective economic governance without curtailing IFFs.
And since we know that trade misinvoicing is the big one, the 83.4% problem, what are the two most critical, high-impact things that governments can do right now to stop that specific mechanism?
The focus has to be on making it exponentially harder to get away with the fraud. It requires aggressive scrutiny of the highest risk transactions.
So where do you start?
First, customs agencies around the world need to treat any trade transaction that involves a tax haven jurisdiction with the absolute highest level of scrutiny.
Assume it's suspicious until proven otherwise.
Exactly. Any deal that is being re-invoiced through a known tax haven should be a massive red flag.
And the second action has to be about closing that information gap that criminals exploit when they fake the price on an invoice.
Precisely. Governments have to invest in boosting their customs enforcement. They need to train their officers to spot this stuff. But the crucial tool is giving them access to real-time, detailed, world market pricing information.
So they can see the real price in real time.
Right. If a customs officer can instantly pull up the average global price for a specific grade of manganese ore on that specific day, it becomes immediately obvious if an exporter is claiming they sold it for half that price, or if an importer is claiming they paid double. Closing that information gap is the key technical fix to stop the fraud.
So we've covered a $7.8 trillion loss, the dual mechanisms of trade fraud and hot money, the devastating impact on GDP, and these really nuanced tech-driven policy responses emerging in Asia. The shadow economy is clearly not one thing. It's a whole spectrum, from a street vendor just trying to survive to a high-level criminal enterprise.
And I think the ultimate takeaway here is that the global economy is in a state of constant transformation. You have this massive push towards digitalization and, slowly but surely, more international regulatory cooperation. And that means the shadow economy isn't going to vanish. It's just going to evolve. It will change its methods as the old doors go closed. So policymakers face this continuous adaptive challenge of changing their frameworks to either integrate this hidden wealth or prevent its criminal extraction. And it's all in the name of securing the domestic resources they need for real sustainable development.